Let's discuss mastering multi-way fundamentals. I realize that many of you play in small and medium stakes games where it is quite common for there to be a raise and a bunch of callers before the flop, and then you have to figure out what to do pre-flop, and also what to do post-flop once you see the flop with multiple players in the pot. So in this video, we are going to discuss all the fundamentals you need to understand to play these situations well. I'm going to do my best to make this video concise, but we are going to discuss pre-flop and post-flop and go through a bunch of examples, so it might be a little bit long. Let's get right to it. Before the flop, as more players enter the pot, you must proceed with more and more caution. And that's because the initial raiser is likely to have something, and the caller has something, right? And you need a much stronger hand to continue against two reasonable ranges compared to only one. And that's especially true as you're against 3 or 4 reasonable ranges. Now, if your opponent's call with all sorts of trash, you still have to proceed with a little bit of caution, because what's going to happen is before the flop, while your opponents do have somewhat wide ranges, after the flop, if you're playing a 6-way pot, well, someone's really likely to have something, even if they are playing a bunch of nonsense. So this generally forces you to play a tighter range. And you're going to find that across the board, offsuit hands, like King-Jack offsuit, are especially terrible multi-way because you're a bit more likely to be dominated. Also, marginal suited hands lose a lot of value because you're way more likely to get flush over flushed. You're also going to find that your 3-betting range, your re-raising range before the flop, is going to become typically more linear and usually tighter, although there are some spots where you may end up 3-betting more. That's especially true as there's a raise and a bunch of callers, especially if the callers have a lot of trash in their range, because you're going to re-raise and then they're going to fold. So let's go through a few GTO pre-flop charts to show what the game theory optimal strategy is in a heads-up pot, and then compare it to a multi-way pot if there's a caller in between you and the initial raiser. We're going to look at deep stacked all the way down to shallow stacked. Here we are, 80 big blinds deep, on the button, versus an under-the-gun 8-handed raise. So under-the-gun 8-handed raises, folds around us on the button. Here's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to re-raise the hands in red, call the hands in green. Notice deep stacked, ace-x suited, and king-x suited really likes to re-raise. Also, we have some blocker re-raises with ace-10 offsuit, king-queen offsuit. And we do a decent amount of calling with a bunch of suited connected type stuff. Hands like jacks and 10s also don't 3-bet. Okay? Now let's compare this to what happens when under the gun 8 raises, and then the cutoff calls. And that's the only thing that's changed. Early position raise, cutoff call. Now, on the button, here's our new range. Notice right off the bat, suited connectors go way down in value, and offsuit hands go way down in value. Right? So notice before, King-Jack offsuit is calling sometimes, ace-10 offsuit is 3-betting sometimes. Now ace-10 offsuit just folds. Ace-Jack offsuit folds half the time and then 3-bets when it plays. King-Jack offsuit's almost never played, right? So notice these hands in this region. This is very important. These hands are often playable, but they completely go down in value when someone raises and there is a call. Okay? Also notice the suited hands. Notice that 9-7 suited just folds in this scenario, and also a bunch of the suited gappers are mostly folding when there's a raise and a call, whereas when there's only a raise and no caller, these hands all get to call because, again, you're a little bit less likely to be dominated when you make a flush. Also notice King-X suited and even some Ace-X suited goes down in value because you're just more likely to end up with top pair bad kicker against top pair with a better kicker, right? So even though these hands do make flushes, they are not quite as good whenever you are playing against a raise and a call, because if you have like King-8 suited and you make top pair, it's just a little bit more likely if someone wants to put a lot of money in that you're going to be dominated. Now, I would say, perhaps exploitatively, I would just call or 3-bet with most ace-x suited still. I think it's perfectly fine to call with ace-x suited, especially if you navigate post-flop well. But pretty much every other adjustment here I think is fine. You do have to be very careful with these suited connected hands. And I see a lot of players splashing around with these suited gappers and suited connectors every single time. And that's a problem. Also, one thing worth noting is that our 3-betting range gets more linear. Notice now we're 3-betting jacks every single time when there's a raise and a call. Whereas when there is just a raise, we're not 3-betting jacks, which is a little bit weird, right? You may think, why would I 3-bet if I'm against more people? It's because you don't mind cleaning up your equity quite as much. If you 3-bet jacks and you win the pot pre-flop and you win an extra 2.5 big blinds or 3 big blinds, however much the initial raise was, that's going to result in you just winning more money. So there's more money for you to win, and typically the preflop caller doesn't have a whole lot of nut hands in their range. Okay, let's take a look at this scenario now, 40 big blinds deep. Okay, 40 big blinds deep, same scenario, just a little bit shallower stacked. Well, a lot shallower stacked. Notice now, relatively similar preflop strategy, 80 big blinds compared to 40 big blinds, except for our implied odds hands go down in value, so we don't get to splash around as much with suited connected type stuff. However, against the under the gun, 8 raise, and a cutoff call, now we really tighten up. Perhaps more than you would think. A lot of people think it'd be sacrilege to fold the 8-7 suited on the button in this situation, but you should. Also notice that because the pot is bigger, we're now going to start having some all-ins. This dark red color is all-in. So 10 shoves all-in, ace-king offsuit, ace-queen offsuit, king-queen suited, and king-jack suited, and ace-queen suited a little bit are shoving all-in this scenario some portion of the time. Also notice our 3-betting range gets really linear in this scenario. Notice before versus just the raise, we were 3-betting still some ace-x suited, king-x suited, offsuit blocker hands, etc. Now, the offsuit hands are still out of here. Suited connectors hands are out of here. And we're 3-betting very, very polarized. I'm sorry, very, very linear. Just the best hands for the most part. Okay? Let's take a look now. 20 big blinds deep. Same scenario, just 20 big blinds deep. On the button versus an under the gun 8 raised. You see, we do not have a small 3-betting range anymore for the most part. We do see tiny slivers of non-all-in 3-bets, but you can ignore those for practical purposes because it's almost none of your range. We are ripping it all in with the hands in dark red for 20 big blinds, and we are calling the hands in green. What if there's a cutoff call? Well, now, interestingly enough, we do start to develop a small 3-betting range, mainly with the nuts, aces, ace-king suited, queens and jacks, and then a few blocker bluffs, which is quite interesting to see. And we're shoving all in with a similar but slightly different range of hands we were shoving with before. It's not that different, really, just more good, strong, big cards. Notice, again, a very linear range. But notice here, we don't get to call anymore. You may be surprised to see no calls in this scenario. I mean, most people would think, oh, call with small pairs. But you have to realize it's detrimental to put in 2 big blinds in this scenario and then have the small blind or the big blind jam it all in. Because then you got to fold, and you just lose 10% of your stack without getting to see the flop. It is really, 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 really bad to put in a 10th of your stack and then just have to fold it away in this scenario. So you just fold. Also with hands like small pairs, when you do get a set, you don't have very good implied odds. So you just got to get out of the way. You have to be really, really tight in these scenarios as you get shallower. Okay, let's take a look at it. Another spot. Now we are going to be 80 big blinds, 20 big blinds, and 40 big blinds deep again. But now we're going to look at the big blind versus a cutoff raise, and then the big blind versus a cutoff raise and a button call. Okay, so here's big blind, 80 big blinds deep versus a cutoff raise. You see lots of calls. We are 3-betting with lots of suited connected type stuff in this scenario. This is just good common GTO stuff. Hopefully you know this already. We have a completely free course at pokercoaching.com that teaches a lot of the fundamentals if these heads-up scenarios are unfamiliar to you. Check out pokercoaching.com/fundamentals. It's free. Go get it. It's an absolute crash course to get you better than your friends at poker. Not at life, only at poker. All right, what happens if there's a raise from the cutoff and a button call? Well, now our 3-bets are going to become way more linear, and these offsuit junky hands are going to start folding out. Suited stuff still gets to call, getting good odds, but the junky offsuit hands go way down in value, and these middle connected hands are going to start calling more often, and these hands in this region are going to start 3-betting more often. So as we see, 80 big blinds deep, the 3-bets are now coming from all the best hands, right? All the best hands are 3-betting. And notice stuff like Queen 7, Jack 7, 10 7, Queen 6. You're going to have a tough time realizing your equity with hands in this region. Okay? Now, here we are, 40 big blinds deep, button versus a cutoff. I'm sorry, big blind versus a cutoff raise. Now you see some all-ins, 40 big blinds deep against just a raise. Hopefully you do have this in your arsenal. You should be shoving hands like 9s, 8s, ace, queen suited, 10, 9 suited, and 4s. Perfectly good poker. That's going to make our small 3-betting range very polarized to nuts. That's these hands up here. And bluffs. Most of our bluffs are going to be blocker bluffs in this region. But facing a raise and a call, you see again, we are now shoving a good, strong, medium strength range. 3-betting far more linearly, plus fewer bluffs. right? Notice we're 3-betting less often in this scenario. And our calling range changes a little bit. The offsuit junk goes down in value. Notice we were calling all King X before and Jack 7 before. Now we're folding out these hands in this region. So hands like Jack 7, Queen 5, King 2. These are some of the hands that really lose their value multi-way. All right, one more spot. Here we are, 20 big blinds deep, big blind versus a cutoff raise. Lots of jamming, only a small bit of 3-betting with the nuts and blocker bluffs again. Lots of calling, though, in the scenario because we're going to realize our equity pretty well in this situation because we make a pair and then we get our money in. What about for facing a button raise and a cutoff call? This is where it gets a little bit interesting. You definitely want to make sure you're studying these scenarios. And you'll see now every ace-x suited shoves, 5s and better shoves, the best suited connected hand shoves, as well as some good ace-x offsuit hands. Notice, though, again, we start to lose some calls. Stuff like Jack 7, King 4, King 5, etc. Right? These are hands that would normally all call. Notice like Jack 3 offsuit calls heads up. But now we are folding out lots of the offsuit stuff. You may ask, why do we not have any small 3-bets now? It's because if we 3-bet small and they get jammed, you're going to be getting the correct odds to call off with basically everything. When that's the case, you don't want to 3-bet small. You just want to rip it in. Okay? So these are some common spots that you will inevitably encounter. As more and more people see the flop, you may opt to not even having a calling range. You may opt to 3-bet everything you plan to play, especially if the players yet to act are highly likely to 3-bet. Now, I will say in most small and medium stakes games, that usually doesn't happen so much, but you do have to be careful with the hands that are very likely to be dominated. Like if you're playing deep stacked cash games and you're in this scenario where, let's say 80 big blinds deep, you're on the button versus an under the gun raise and a hijack call and a low jack call and a cutoff call, you should still be playing something like this, maybe even a little bit tighter. Like these King X's and these junkier suited connectors are going to go way down in value. And that's just because they're more and more likely to be highly dominated. All right? You have to avoid spots where you are highly likely to be dominated. So again, offsuit hands go way down in value. If there's a raise and a call and a call and a call and you have the King 10 offsuit, you should literally never even consider playing it. Okay? Also, marginal suited hands lose a ton of value too. And your 3-betting range goes from being quite polarized, like in this scenario, to way more linear. You're going to find that hands like jacks, queens, ace-king, ace-queen, these hands much prefer to just 3-bet a little bit more often and pick up the pot. Now let's discuss post-flop. Some of these terms may be unfamiliar to you. If you've been through my Tournament and Cash Game Masterclass, you will know these by heart, hopefully at this point, but we're going to briefly go through a few concepts. The idea of range and nut advantage are very important because they determine who is favored in the hand. As you have a bigger range and nut advantage, you get to bet more often or use large sizes. Understand, though, that when you are playing in a multi-way pot, each person's range and nut advantage is greatly reduced as more and more ranges see the flop. Because if you're normally, let's say, roughly 50-50, now you're 33-33-33, plus or minus a little bit, right? So because they are reduced, the strategies that come from a large range or nut advantage are also reduced, which means that you're going to be betting the flop every time, basically never. If you're in a multi-way scenario, you should almost never continuation bet the flop with your entire range. Even if the flop is pretty good for your range, you still should do a decent amount of checking. And that checking is usually going to come from your medium strength made hands and just garbage. If you flop garbage multi-way, you're done. Get out. Also, huge bet sizes will no longer occur, quite often on very dynamic boards, meaning the flop is very coordinated and likely to change a lot by the river. Usually you're going to be using big bets in those scenarios, heads up with a polarized range of your very strong made hands and draws, and some bluffs. But multi-way, your big size goes down. Okay? General adjustments. Because of this, is multi-way you're going to check way more often, especially when you lack any sort of range and nut advantage. And you're going to be using much smaller bets in multi-way pots. This is a little bit counterintuitive to some people because they think that in multi-way pots, they should be more inclined to bet bigger. And they want to bet more often to protect their hand. The problem, though, is that you're just way more likely to be crushed. And when you're way more likely to be crushed, you don't want to be using big bet sizes and you don't want to be betting all that often. Someone's likely to have something, and if it's not you, it's probably someone else. Also, the idea of minimum defense frequency, meaning I need to defend with some chunk of my range so my opponent does not run me over, becomes way less relevant because the minimum defense frequency is shared by all the players facing aggression. Let's say you're in a scenario where normally your opponent bets and you want to defend with, 60% of your range. If you're in a heads-up pot with 3 people facing that bet, now it's kind of like 20% of your range each. And 20% of your range, if you think about the top 20% of any range, that's not all that many hands, which allows you to do a lot of folding. Again, I know a lot of players in a lot of small stakes games just don't fold to bets on the flop, and they're torching their money. It's also important to realize that equity realization goes down when multiple people see the flop, especially when you're not closing the action. So there are a lot of spots multi-way where, say someone raises and you call with some good suited connector, 4 other people call, the flop comes, you flop middle pair, and the initial raiser bets. In that spot, middle pair is not great, and you probably just want to ditch it immediately. Just fold. Yeah, you're drawn to 5 outs, but there's no guarantee they're good, and if you call and someone raises, now you have to fold, and you just lose tons of equity. So, again, general adjustments. Multi-way, you're going to be defending significantly tighter when facing bets, and you're going to want to overfold when you're not closing the action, meaning there's people yet to act, due to poor equity realization. Next, hand strength and equity distribution. Your hand strengths typically get downgraded in multi-way pots. In heads-up pots, top pair with a good kicker's good to play for a lot of money. But not necessarily multi-way, especially as the pot becomes very multi-way. I mean, there are scenarios where, say, someone raises, someone calls, you call, queen jack suited on the button. It comes jack, 9, 3. If someone bets and someone calls, queen jack's just a fold. Ditch it immediately. Don't get involved. But a lot of people can't fold top pair without realizing top pair 4 ways after the flop is not in good shape. Okay? Also realize that the reason for this is because when someone bets and someone calls, the continuing ranges that people are calling with has to be a whole lot tighter. Therefore, you need a whole lot more equity to put money in the pot. That said, the idea of cleaning up equity gets more merit in multi-way pots, which sometimes will result in you betting with some strong but non-premium hands. Maybe like say you raise, the button calls and the big blind calls, and the flop comes jack 8, 6, and you have pocket 10s. That's a spot where heads up, you'd probably just check it back and hope you don't see an overcard. But multi-way, you should be a little bit more inclined to bet a hand like that when you're check to, because that's going to force your opponents to fold out one random overcard or a gut shot or something like that. So sometimes cleaning up equity gains a lot of merit. So general adjustments because of this are you're going to construct your bets in a far more linear range. You're not just going to be betting with airball bluffs. You're giving up with the airballs. Airball is no good. No equity bluffs are bad. And you're going to be betting more often with hands that really need protection when you do decide to bet. When you have the option to use aggression. Compared to heads-up pots, you're going to be checking way more often. And you're going to use smaller bet sizes on average. And instead of betting with a polarized range, which you very often do in heads-up pots, your range is going to become far more linear when you are putting money into the pot. And when you are facing aggression, you're going to want to defend, significantly tighter. And that is especially true when you are not the one closing the action. All right, let's go through some examples. We're going to be playing 40 big blinds deep in all of these. All these pots are multi-way, of course. We raise it up with kings in the low jack seat. Button calls, big blind calls. Flop comes queen, 3, 2. This is a spot where a lot of people continuation bet every single time. But if you think about our range, top pair really doesn't need a whole lot of protection here because the only bad turn for top pair is an ace or a king. The only 2 bad turns, I guess. Obviously, a 6, 5, or 4 could be bad too, but you're not usually so worried about random gut shots and open-ended straight draws when they're kind of unlikely to begin with. So this is a spot where we're going to be looking to check raise, actually, and get a lot of money in the pot. This would be a little bit different if the top card on the board was lower. But in this scenario, kings especially doesn't need protection because it's really only worried about the ace. So we're going to check, looking to check raise this spot. We'll also check raise with a smattering of bluffs. Flop checks through. Turn is the jack of spades and the big blind checks. Take a second, think about it. What should you do here? Now the board is far more dynamic. By the way, treat all these like quizzes. Write some answers in the comment section below. The board is far more dynamic now. Notice on the river, any spade is bad, any ace is bad. We could lose on a king, but we're not worried about that. 10 and 9 are bad. 5 and 4 are still like marginal. So this is a spot where we don't mind putting the money in the pot because there's a lot of hands in the opponent's ranges that they will now continue with every single time. Like any queen or jack's going to call. And because the board is quite dynamic, meaning, again, our hands that are almost always good right now, like pocket kings, are somewhat likely to get outdrawn. This is a spot we're going to be wanting to use a big size. If this was a heads-up pot, we may be using a pot size bet or more. But in a multi-way pot, our big bet is going to be smaller, something like 2/3 pot. So we go 2/3 pot, button calls, big blind folds. River's a 7 of clubs. Now we're heads up. Take a second, think about it. Write what you would do in the comment section below. Quiz yourself. Make good use of this opportunity. All right. I think this is a spot where we want to bet big. Question is how big? And in this scenario, we decide to go for all of it. Why are we going for all of it with kings? You may think, won't they fold everything that beats us, or that we beat? And the answer is obviously no. Whenever the river bricks off, such that every draw misses, you want to be going for full value with hands that do not block your opponent's hands that I think automatically have to call, like any queen. You may say, your opponent can't have a queen. They check through on the flop. They certainly could if they know how to play multi-way. You have to be really, really cautious in multi-way pots. And just like we didn't need to bet for value / protection, they didn't necessarily need to bet for value / protection. So this is a spot where I love a big bet. We do go for it. Opponent does call this time. Queen 10 suited. And I think they played this hand well. They just ran into it. Now you may say, if you're jamming kings, they should fold. But you got to realize we have a lot of potential bluffs available here. And we will go for it some portion of the time. Here we have pocket nines. We raise it up. Button calls. Big blind calls. Flop comes Jack 8-6. This is a board where, again, heads up. Now heads up, we may check this hand back. But multi-way, I think we definitely want to bet this because we could be good, but we're now extremely vulnerable, right? Ace, king, queen, 10, 7, 5, 4. All of those are kind of bad turns. 8 and 6 are bad too. So I think we can easily bet here and then see what develops. If we get called by 2 players, we're definitely going to be done with it. If we get called and raised, we're obviously done with it. If we get called by 1 player, we'll proceed with caution. And that's the plan. We get called by 1 player. Turns it to a spades. Now we don't need to worry about protection so much. Plus we could easily be crushed by any jack. So check, check. Planning to call on a lot of rivers here. The thing is, in this scenario, we could be against a draw, so you may think like a 10's obviously bad for us. But you got to realize they could have an 8, which we beat anyway, and they may decide to value bet it or bluff it. But they could also have 10-9, 9-7, an 8, just backdoor flush draw. Who knows what they could have in this spot. Worth noting, by the way, our flop bet was pretty small, 2,700 and 8,100. You do not need to go big in multi-way pots. All right. Check, check, turn. River, the opponent bets. Small, a 3rd pot. I don't think there's much value in raising here. They could easily do this with a jack, so just call. We're not folding, by the way. Do not fold here. That would be a pretty big mistake, even though we do block some of the logical bluffs. Ace-8 for thin value. Fine and good. I think the opponent played that fine. Maybe they're supposed to check the river, but I don't mind a small bet on the river from them. 10s, we raise it up. Small blind calls, big blind calls, flop comes 9-7-3, super dynamic board. Notice here our board is our hand is incredibly vulnerable to being outdrawn, right? Spades are terrible, all the straight cards are terrible, 9 and 7 are terrible. So we definitely need to bet this. And we're going to want to use a slightly big size. Again, if we were heads up, maybe we'd want to be using even a bigger size, but multi-way, we don't need to go gigantic like pot. So we need to go 4,500. The big blind jams. Great. We could obviously be crushed by a few hands in this scenario. We're pretty likely to be against a draw or a 9, which we crush. So this is a trivially easy call. I'd be calling off here with a lot of 9s, really, and I think the bad 9s are probably close. Everything better than a 9 is just an easy call in this scenario. We do call. King 9. Good. Ace, queen offsuit, re-raise, button calls, big blind calls, ace, king, 5. All right. This is a board that should connect pretty well with the button calling range. They should have a whole lot of ace X in their range, also a lot of king X in their range. I could obviously have those two, but we are not going to have a gigantic range and nut advantage here because we're multi-way. The big blind's equity is obviously in the dumpster. They're terrible, but the button should be pretty good here. So we need to check some portion of the time, especially with hands that are almost always good and not all that vulnerable to being outdrawn. Like this one. This is a board where if you consider our good hands, like any ace, they're all not all that vulnerable to being outdrawn. So this is a pretty good spot to check. We check. Button bets small. Big blind calls. Now, if you consider what a small betting range looks like and a calling range looks like, both players have pretty good equity. At least some equity, right? And now this is a spot where we're going to want to check raise. I realize a lot of people may have difficulty finding bluffs in these scenarios, but you should go for bluffs every once in a while, especially as the small betting range gets weaker and weaker. Hands like gut shots, especially blocking ace, queen, ace, jack, and ace 10 for your opponent are going to be pretty good ones to go for this with, I think. Backdoor flush draw is probably pretty good too with those blockers. You want to have a gut shot to check raise here. We're only check raising for value with a pretty strong range, so we don't need to be check raise bluffing all that often. So we don't go for the raise to 8,000. Fold, fold. We win the pot. A lot of people look at this and say, oh, well, we didn't stack our opponents. We also didn't get outdrawn, and we didn't let them see the turn in the river, which is good for us. 8-4 suited. Low jack raises. Small blind calls. We call. Remember again, you cannot be folding suited hands. We looked at this spot close to specifically. Flop comes. Jack, 8, 7. Check, check. We're not going to lead in this scenario because if you think about the low jack range and the small blind range, they're both going to have lots of straights, sets, 2 pairs, so no point in leading in this spot. Low jack bets 2,500, a third pot. Small blind calls. What should we do? Take a second, think about it. Fold. We are going to be so dominated in this scenario. Even if we get a 4, we could still lose. If we get an 8, we could still lose. Get out of the way and move on with your life. A pair is not all that great multi-way when multiple people put money in the pot. Low jack raises, king, queen offsuit. Maybe we 3-bet sometimes, but we're going to call. Big blind calls, king, jack, 8, check, check. Nice dynamic board. We are going to bet. You're going to find in position, you often want to use like smallish bet sizes. Just in general, I'd realize this board is very dynamic. In position, though, we don't really care if people stick around. We bet small. Big blind calls only. Now we're playing like a heads-up pot, right? Big blind checks. And we're definitely going to bet here. Our hand is almost always good but vulnerable, right? Board's very draw-heavy. I do realize we could be crushed right now, but I think the opponent will put their money in with stuff like king jack, queen jack, draws. So yeah, it's a dicey scenario if our opponent wants to play for all the money, but look, we only have 27 big blinds. You can't be worried about the few hands that crush us. Opponent calls, river's a 10 of clubs. They check. Obviously check it back. Now we are not in good shape. The opponent's going to have a tough time calling with too many worse hands, so check, check. They have the flush. We lose. Notice here, if we bet the turn and they ripped it in our face, we were going to call. River would have been the 10 of clubs. We would have lost. That is okay. Sometimes they're going to lose. Ace, 2 of spades. Low jack raise. We call. Big blind calls. King 7-2. Check, check. All right. In spots like this, you're going to have a tough time finding logical bluffs. And I'm not really sure you want to bet stuff like backdoor flush draws and backdoor straight draws multi-way. If we were heads up, something like 9-8 of hearts would be a fine hand to bluff. But multi-way, these very low equity bluffs should just not be used. So you're very often going to want to use whatever bottom pairs you have, because you're usually not going to have very many bottom pairs. And these hands usually have 5 pretty clean outs. So bottom pair, especially with backdoor flush draw, is a very good hand to bluff multi-way. This is something almost no one does, but you should. And considering the fact that we're not going to be betting the flop with too many backdoor draws and whatnot, we need to find triple barrels. And I can already tell you, we're going to be teeing up a triple barrel in the scenario some portion of the time. Notice, though, we're still using the small bet, especially on this incredibly dry board. Probably even go smaller, really. Turns an 8, check, check. Just bet, load money into the pot. It's time. As we have more gut shots in the scenario and whatnot, we may want to consider bluffing a little bit less often with pairs. But right here, our pair is like never good, right? So when your pair's basically never good, it's a 5-out draw. If we bet here and get jammed, of course, we're going to fold. Low jack calls. Feels like they have a king, huh? River's a 9, they check. Put it in. This is exactly how I would play a set. It's exactly how I would play king-queen, right? And like I said, we really don't have a ton of bluffs here. And if we did decide to go for it with a random jack 10, we just got him. We do jam. Sometimes they're going to call and sometimes you're going to lose. But if you literally never bluff the river, as I know a lot of people don't do in multi-way pots, you're going to be easy to play against. All right, a few more hands and we'll call it a day. Button raises, we call small blind. Big blind calls. This is a fine hand to call with. Study your pre-flop charts. Ooh. So now, this is a spot where, considering our range contains a whole lot of decently strong middle connected hands, I think this is a pretty nice spot to bet multi-way. If we were heads up, maybe we don't do a whole lot of betting, but multi-way, I think we certainly do want to bet on this somewhat draw-heavy board. So we do bet. Big blind calls. We're going to be crushing the range here. I can already tell you, just bet flop, bet turn, bet river, right? Unless it runs off pretty bad for us. River's great for us. Bet flop, bet turn, jam, river. Easy game. They were set up, and they lose. King 9 suited. Button raises. We call small blind. Big blind calls. Jack 10, 6. Should we lead this one? Well, similar scenario. This board nails our range, which is kind of fun to consider. Also, the board's super dynamic, so we're going to be betting using a larger size. Again, not an egregiously big size, but a larger size. We get called by the button. Turns a 2 of hearts. Here we go. This time, though, we decide to check. We've discussed this a lot in our advanced tournament course, where when you're about 40-ish big blinds deep, and you have a draw that really cannot bet and then call a shove, but has excellent equity, you need to be checking it, because you can easily check shove it. Whenever you have a high equity draw, that if you bet it, you would have to fold to an all-in, and it's reasonably likely your opponent will shove it all in on this very draw-heavy board. Don't bet, because betting here and having to fold a straight flush draw, straight and flush draw, would be an absolute disaster. So you got to check it. We check, opponent bets. Now we can jam them. Bam. Sometimes they call, sometimes they don't. And this is a spot where the opponent should also not be betting with their high equity draws. They just got to check it back too for the same reason. Interesting to see the opponent bet here and then fold to a shove. You got to think they're starting to get a lot of money in the pot. But whatever, we bet all in. We wanted to give it a spin, but they didn't let us. One more hand. Low jack raises, button calls, you know, defend the king, queen 8, or queen 7 suited. We discussed this one earlier. We flop a draw. This board nails our range in the big blind. Small flops nail the big blind's range. Middle boards nail the small blind's calling range. And because of that, middle card boards, small blind gets to lead some portion of the time. Low card boards, big blind gets to lead some portion of the time. We go tiny. We're going tiny because we're essentially pushing a range advantage here. I have all the straight sets, 2 pairs, etc., and our opponents don't have all the straight sets and 2 pair. We bet tiny. Opponent calls. I can already tell you we're going to be going for it here with a 7 because 7 blocks them from having 8-7, which is a hand they could have, but we just block it, right? If we remove one combination of 8-7, now they're, well, three combinations in the range instead of 4, which is valuable. We're going to be betting kind of big. Opponent calls. River's a jack. We put it all in. You may be thinking, should we really be bluffing it all in? Isn't that risky? It is risky. But if you do the same thing with your straight sets, 2 pairs, etc., you get to bluff sometimes. And in this scenario, our hand's a pretty good hand to bluff. Let's pretend like they call us. We actually lose that time. Oh no. Such is life. All right. That's it for mastering the fundamentals of multi-way. I know this video was a little bit long. Thank you for sticking with me. If you stuck with me, click the like and subscribe button below. It's very important that you understand multi-way, you have to be way more cautious, and you rarely lack the range and nut advantage to a huge degree. So when you have the option to use aggression, check way more often. And also, you're going to be using smaller sizes on average. If you're playing in a heads-up pot, if you would normally want to bet, let's say, 3/4 pot, maybe instead bet like 60% pot. If you normally bet 33% pot with your small bet, maybe the number becomes 1 big blind. Also, you're typically going to want to be betting in general in just a more linear manner. You want to be betting with your best hands and putting money in the pot with your best hands and fewer bluffs, especially with total garbage bluffs. All of your bluffs multi-way are going to have some sort of equity. When you're facing aggression, when people are betting into you, you need to defend significantly tighter. And when there's a bet and a call before you, or a bet and a raise before you, especially when a bet and a call and a call and a call, you really, really, really need to tighten up, unless you're drawing to a hand that's going to be the effective nuts when it gets there. So that's it. That's mastering multi-way pots. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, click the like and subscribe button below. Tell your friends who struggle at multi-way pots. I know every single one of you out there has a friend who struggles in multi-way pots because they're all typing in the comment section down below. Some of them don't know about this channel though, so help them out and help me out too at the same time. Good luck, have fun, and hope you crush them in all the multi-way pots.